So first of all, I'd just like to say thanks to everybody for joining us on today's webinar. We're really excited to talk to you about the OWASP API Top 10 updated version for 2023. We're going to be going through some of a, kind of a compare and contrast exercise, looking at what's changed from 2019 to today, talking about some of those differences, some of the things that stayed the same, talking about some analysis around some of the issues identified, as well as discussing some technical details and discussing some implications for strategy around API security. So before we kind of kick off, just wanted to give everybody a quick overview on how today's session will go. We'll try to keep the webinar to kind of the 35 to 40-minute range. We will do our best from our side as the presenters to keep the content under 35-ish minutes to try to leave a good 5 minutes of Q&A time at the end. Please do drop any questions as you go into the chat window. If it makes sense, I'll try to work them into the course of the presentation. If that's not possible, we'll certainly have time for Q&A at the end. So as I mentioned, the big focus of today's presentation is going to be on that OWASP API Top 10 2023 edition. If you haven't had a chance to review it, well, you're in luck, because today we will be talking about that and helping you understand what's changed. We'll also talk about why this has changed, why some of the priorities might have shifted, and why some items have sort of stayed the same, but also sort of changed. And again, what does this mean for you with regards to your own organization's API strategy? As I mentioned, time for Q&A. We have also prepared a report around this that we will be sharing in the presentation, and we'll also be sharing a link for everybody who's joining us today. Couple things in the way of housekeeping. As I mentioned, there is a chat window. You should all be able to drop any questions that you have into that window. Please, I would encourage you to do so. I do see all of that. Similarly, if you start to see that you have any technical challenges, you can try, and we will do our best to sort you out on that side. Also, just from a standpoint of logistics, today's session is being recorded, and the recording and the report will be available after the webinar. We will be sending that out to everybody who RSVP'd automatically in just after the event. If you lose connection for any reason, or you do have to leave the webinar early for whatever reason, fear not, you will have access to that recording after the fact. And similarly, if you want to share it with a friend, a coworker, an acquaintance, you'll be able to do that as well. So just by way of introductions, my name is Jeremy Snyder. I'm the founder and CEO of FireTail. I'll be hosting today's session, but the bulk of the presentation today will be done by my coworker, Paul Geoffrion, who is our Director of Customer Success. Paul, do you want to say hi and share a few words about yourself?
Sure. Yeah. As you mentioned, I'm the Director of Customer Success here at FireTail. Been with the company for around a year at this point. Before that, I was working in since roughly 2017, cloud security posture management. So hopefully I can share some of my learnings over the past year of research in API security, and then tie it back to my experience previously as well.
Awesome. Great. Well, thanks for taking the time, and certainly thank you so much for all the work that you've done in preparation for today's webinar and preparing that report that I mentioned, and also doing the analysis work around the changes in this space. I've talked a lot about changes kind of in the introduction here, but I think actually before we dive into the changes, it's kind of notable that in 4 years since the last revision of the OWASP API Top 10, here we are in 2023, and even 4 years later, the top 2 items have remained the same. So first, can you kind of help us understand these vulnerabilities, why you think they're so prevalent, and why nothing has changed on this front in that 4-year time period?
Sure. Okay, let me break down your question here. So first, what are these vulnerabilities, and why haven't they changed? So, well, there has been a slight change. You can see, at least for the second item, we've gone from broken user authentication to broken authentication. I think that's just from a vocabulary standpoint, making it so that we're tackling authentication not just for user objects, but also for apologies about the noise in the background. But yeah, covering authentication for more than just user objects. And then for broken object level authorization, that's just the authorization at every level. We'll get into actually the specific differences between those two vulnerabilities. I know they're oftentimes confused by developers, which does end up leading to some breaches.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, speaking of breaches, I think, one of the interesting things is that we've done some analysis work around breaches, and it does seem like these two items come up again and again. And, I guess one of the things to kind of highlight here that I'd like to try to understand for the audience is, when we talk about something like broken object level authorization, or BOLA as it's often called, just understanding what that means and how that actually works, I think could be very useful for the audience. I know you've got an example here that we've prepared. Could you kind of go through that for the audience and help them understand, what does BOLA actually mean?
Sure. So in the example that we see here, we can see that the attacker on the left-hand side is authenticating himself to the user 1041. And so that's fine, right? That's expected. The attacker probably went through a normal path for sign up and then was able to get authenticated by the platform. What's not okay here is that, well, for one, since the user identifiers that we're using here are sequential, you can see it's going from 1040, 1041, 1042. Those are extremely predictable, right? It's very easy for the attacker to then easily query those other user objects. Now, where we get into authorization here, or broken object level authorization, is when this attacker, despite only being authenticated to user 1041, is also able to request and receive the user objects of other users, despite having no authorization for it.
Okay. And so it sounds like what's missing in that case is, okay, we know that you are user ID, or the attacker is user ID 1041. What's missing is then this check that says, is user ID 1041 allowed to access data record 1042 and 1043, if I understand you correctly?
That's absolutely right, Jeremy. And I do want to point out, just because we glanced over the previous slide, that's the research that we've done, right, over the past 10 years of breaches to APIs. Essentially, we've noticed that authorization and authentication have been the primary cause for the vast majority of data breaches for enterprises and governments. API related data breaches and yeah, attacks. So
Right,
if you're
right.
covering at least these two, you're doing the vast majority of the work to secure your APIs. And that's why, again, they haven't changed, or there has only been a very slight change in the wording between the 2019 version of OWASP and the version that's been released this year.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I kind of went back to the slide as you were talking there for the benefit of our audience. So anybody who wants to kind of see the breakdown across those categories and maybe capture this or anything like that, I did want to point out as well that the analysis work around this is also available in our API security report that is on our website as well. So if you want the full details, please do feel free to check that out as well. So we talked about BOLA. Let's talk for a second about this kind of question of authentication and authorization, because I do know that this kind of comes up very often, and I think there's a lot of confusion around what is authentication, what is authorization, why are they not the same thing?
Sure.
I know if we would zoom out for a second, objectively we all know that they're not the same thing, but maybe just kind of like for full explicit clarity, explain here, just remind the audience, what is authentication, what is authorization.
Yeah, authentication is basically I am who I say I am. Authorization is, am I allowed to do what I say I'm allowed to do? This, despite it's a separate concept to authentication. And I do want to emphasize that oftentimes security professionals are going to uh, abbreviate these two words to just auth, which can lead to some confusion. Much better to use auth N for authentication and auth Z for authorization, just to make that clear distinction.
Yeah, I think that's a great piece of advice to just kind of keep in your mind as you're having those conversations around identity management relative to APIs. Auth is a kind of confusing shortening, so just try to make sure to be very explicitly clear. And if we kind of think for a second about that previous example that we gave, authentication would be establishing that that was user 1041. Authorization would be the check afterwards to see whether 1041 is allowed to access 1042 and 1043's data. Great.
That's right.
So I wanted to take a second to kind of talk about what I think is maybe a point of some confusion for a lot of people who think about securing APIs, because we've got this thing called a web application firewall, and it's existed for a very long time. And I know a lot of organizations use them, but I know you've done some analysis work around web application firewalls and whether they do or don't work for API related issues, specifically related to authentication and authorization. I want to pull up a chart here that I know you've put together. Talk us through what we're looking at here, and why it does kind of lead us down the direction of what you've titled here. Existing approaches just don't cut it. Help us understand what is it that's missing, or what is it that we need to look at from the standpoint of authentication and authorization that we don't see with the WAF.
Sure. I think to answer that question, I'm going to need to at least mention a little bit of the history behind the API security. I think if we come back 10 years, APIs wasn't as much of a used word, or at least it wasn't as much of a concept that was used to define products and types of infrastructure. People back then were more talking about the network layer. And that's when web application firewalls were enough, right, to monitor that network layer of data passing through to your infrastructure. Nowadays, we need a lot more context if we're going to be at least aware of what's going on with our APIs. So if you're exclusively using a WAF to protect your APIs, you're not going to get visibility into the arguments and the request parameters that are being used by the requesters, the people actually trying to use your API. And then in response, you're not also going to get the request payloads that they're putting in and the response payloads. So you just don't have any idea of what your application is doing with the traffic that's hitting it.
Yeah.
Versus,
I think that's
the right-hand column.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to mention the right-hand column. Whereas if you're looking at API logs from the application layer, keep in mind, API stands for Application Programming Interface. If you go to the application layer, that's where you're going to get the best visibility.
Right. So that's kind of deeply integrated into the application logic, pulling out those elements that you mentioned, the arguments and the request parameters, and potentially the request and the response payloads that help to kind of map out what actually happened in that API transaction to understand the flow of authentication and authorization and whether it should or should not have been approved. So that's super helpful. I want to kind of get back to our train of talk around some of the updates, and kind of want to start with one of these new items that has this, just roll off the tongue acronym. I'm sure everybody's going to love talking about BOPLA for the next couple of years. So can you break this down and help us understand what this is?
Sure. So it stands for Broken Object Property Level Authorization. And it's essentially a combination of two items from the 2019 list. So if you look at mass assignments and you look at excessive data exposure, those two items were essentially two faces of the same coin. So it's either you're breaking into object properties to exfiltrate what should be confidential, or you're modifying an object's properties to gain some sort of advantage with that system. So if you combine both of them, you get broken object property level authorization. So I think a good example to
example. Yeah,
sure.
Please.
Read your mind there. The idea is essentially if a marketing team is trying to put up, let's say, a rotating user feed on the public website, and that rotating user feed essentially displays the user's first name and the city that they're from. That's innocent enough, right? There's no personally identifiable information there that warrants notification of a breach. The problem is when the developer that's charged with implementing this feature returns from the user database the whole user object to the public website. So then it becomes very easy for any sort of client, any sort of attacker, any sort of user to then see those full user objects. You don't need any hacker tools to do this. Just your standard web browser will be enough to get that stuff. Worse would be if those users are then able to call that endpoint, the user's endpoint, the user's database, and actually make modifications to the user objects. That would be, a whole broken object property level authorization shit show. Excuse the phrasing.
Yeah, no worries, no worries. I think we can all talk openly about the challenges of some of these security issues. All good. I'm sure the audience won't mind the fruity language a little bit here and there. I want us to move forward a little bit, and just very quickly, could you talk on a couple of mitigation strategies around this BOPLA issue?
Yeah, definitely. You should plan your inputs and your outputs when it comes to your APIs, where you're fetching data from the back end and presenting it in the front ends. You should handle data sanitization from the server side so that there's no possibility of any extra excessive data being returned to the front ends. And you should also definitely maintain an API contract. And ideally, make sure that it's also being enforced, though that can get a little bit complicated for organizations. I understand that.
Got it. Got it. That's great. I think that's super helpful for the audience. So just remember those couple strategies. So moving on, we've got a little change in the fourth item on the list. We've moved from kind of lack of resources and rate limiting to unrestricted resource consumption. Talk to us a little bit about this theme in general and why the slight change as you see it.
Yeah, it's as you said, it's a very slight change in the sense that it's essentially a rewording. We're going from looking at the uh, cause of the problem to the the vulnerability itself. Is you're
Okay.
allowing for unrestricted resource consumption. So essentially, this vulnerability is that your server is getting so much traffic, so much fake traffic, that it's unable to serve real users, real customers. And so oftentimes we're speaking about distributed denial of service attacks here. So one way to mitigate this would be to implement resource and rate limiting and pagination for your APIs. Make sure that you're not returning everything, every single thing that's being asked for. Limits into bite-sized chunks what can be sent back. And then also, as much as possible, monitor and block suspicious traffic, malform
Yeah.
requests that are just using up your compute time without actually attempting to do a legitimate transaction.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point because around this, I know, historically we've thought about DDoS as basically just flooding something with traffic, period. But on the side of the API, that last point that you raised, which is kind of certain parts of the transaction flow that take up a lot of compute time, that can be an effective DDoS attack strategy as well as just say, oh, okay, your authentication endpoint is super slow. Well, I'm just going to flood specifically that with a bunch of authentication requests that look like normal API traffic. And we have seen attacks that look like that out in the real world. So that's a great point to highlight. So moving on to the next item, it looks like we've got kind of a this new one called uh, sorry sorry we've got this one called
Unrestricted access
unrestricted
to
access to sensitive business flows. What is this all about?
Sure. So it's a new one for this year. I don't think there was an equivalent one for 2019 that we can really make a legitimate sort of comparison point to. Essentially, here, and I think it goes to show how much APIs have risen in importance over the past 4 years. Essentially, because now it's very normal for wide sets of users to interact with a software in a programmatic way using APIs to do very normal transactions. Um, the example that I like to use here for a breach that was caused by this unrestricted access to sensitive business flows is something that happened actually a few months ago when there were some Taylor Swift tickets being sold on one of the most popular platforms for ticketing. Essentially, what happened is that within the first 15 minutes or first 10 minutes or so of those tickets being put online, they were all bought up automatically by bots. Uh, Essentially, the sensitive business flow here of being able to purchase tickets was unrestricted. That perhaps could have been mitigated with some captcha checks or some other user flow analysis to be able to make the difference of who's a real user and who's a fake user. What ended up happening
Yeah.
is that this ticket vendor was dragged in front of the U.S. Congress to have to explain themselves to all the Congress people as to why their children weren't able to buy tickets for the concert. So yeah,
Yeah.
something to keep in mind uh, for your own apps.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and you can see, to the audience, you can see that's kind of the third bullet point example we've got there. We've got a couple other examples that are kind of taken from real world scenarios that have been observed or discovered by security researchers who have been looking at flaws around APIs. So hopefully that gives you some perspective on why this is so impactful and why it's an important new addition to the list. So moving on, we've got another new item on the list. Or we've got kind of like two new items here. We see, a little bit of a change with security misconfiguration dropping down a spot, and we've got this new entry, server side request forgery, SSRF, which I think is an acronym many of us will have seen. What's happening here?
Sure. So let's first talk about server-side request forgery. This is essentially where an attacker would use a vulnerability, this type of request forgery, to move laterally from a public-facing server to internal-only resources. So this can obviously lead to data exfiltration if the server is then forced to interact with resources that it wasn't meant to interact with or wasn't initially intended to interact with. So the example here is if, for example, your web app allows for users to provide a URL to provide their profile pictures. Instead of providing a very normal URL with a PNG or a JPEG there, an attacker could provide a link to an internal resource in your own system. So if your API hasn't been designed hardened against this type of attack to make sure that it can only interact with whitelisted or allow listed addresses of resources, then it's quite possible that it's just going to feed back the information that's been requested, for example, the whole users table or something like that. So yeah, definitely something to watch out for.
Awesome. And kind of the second part of that, so that's the SSRF side of it. Can you give us some example of security misconfigurations? It looks like you've got a few outlined, but to me, when I see the title security
Yeah,
misconfiguration, that's such a broad category that I almost don't even know where to start thinking about it.
that's so true, Jeremy. And I think that's might be actually one of the reasons why it's dropped off in priority from at least one rank, because it is such a vague
Okay.
category that has a lot of different ways to be interpreted. So just to name a few, you can use secure transport protocols. You can have, if you have proper HTTP methods in place, not access ones that you don't actually need. If you're using security headers and you follow the well-architected framework or other comprehensive infrastructure governance frameworks, you're going to be a lot better place with regards to security misconfigurations. The idea here is try to follow as many best practices, the latest best practices as you can with regards to the setup of your APIs.
Gotcha. That makes total sense. So moving on, the next one we've got is looks like a little bit of a title change, but I'm not sure that the gist of this next item, number 9 here, is really all that different. Looks like we've gone from improper assets management to improper inventory management. Talk to us a little bit about your understanding about what is this concept and what the slight change might be.
Yeah, I think part of this is the influence that the evolution of cloud security has had over the whole IT security industry. So it's a very common concept in cloud security to have an inventory, to at least know what you have in terms of resources powering your infrastructure. I think that's exact same concept is being brought over to APIs. So we're moving from improper assets management to a more holistic inventory management that includes more than just the API, let's say, assets. It may include, especially given that the next one, insufficient logging and monitoring, has been removed from this year's list.
Okay.
I think it now belongs to this improper inventory management category, where
Okay.
your inventory should also include logging capabilities, centralized logging, taking in the traffic from as many places as you can.
Yeah. Yeah, and that makes total sense. I know, just as you said, you and I both have a background in some experience in cloud security. And I know one of the challenges that I've seen a lot of organizations face relative to their APIs is that when you think about cloud platforms, APIs can kind of live anywhere. They can live on virtual machines. They can live inside containers. They can live on serverless functions. They might or might not have any number of network infrastructure components in front of them, like load balancers, API gateways, WAFs, or some combination thereof. And I know a challenge I've heard from a lot of organizations is that all of those things log to different locations by default. And so you have this challenge of kind of getting all your logs together in one place in order to do good analysis of what's happened with your APIs, what kind of traffic there's been, what kind of potential malicious behavior there have been. So I totally see the importance of API logging. I think you're probably right. It's kind of implied under inventory management with this new item. Just a quick call out
And
to
at
our
this point,
audience here. We're coming.
yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, I was just going to mention at this point for improper assets management, we've just talked about the runtime protection side of things, the production assets management side of things. But this should also include having a proper release management. So you don't have any zombie APIs coming back to haunt you in the future as you've released patches for your latest APIs. You should also be running distinct pre-production, production, from a sandbox, development, test, staging, and prod environments for your APIs so you can properly test it out and make sure you have no production data in any pre-production environment. So all of this type of stuff I think is included in this category.
Yeah, makes sense. I mean, a lot of it is kind of security slash IT hygiene related topics as well that are kind of general best practices, and I think can often get forgotten in the rush to release the latest and greatest and the newest cool thing that is going to move the business forward relative to that API. And on that one point that you raised there around releases, I know there's been issues out in the wild where organizations have had previous versions of APIs. You mentioned, people tend to patch only the newest version of the API going forward, but they might still have partners that are consuming old versions of the APIs that are still left online, and those older releases might still have vulnerabilities in them. So I would say that also kind of falls into this category of asset management. Would you agree?
100%.
Awesome. Just a quick note to our audience. We're coming up towards the end of the top 10 list and some of the analysis there. And I did want to kind of put the call out for any additional questions. Please feel free to get those in the next few minutes. We'll be moving into Q&A here pretty shortly. So moving forward on our list of items, we've got this last one, unsafe consumption of APIs. It seems like this is a brand new entry to the list, and this is kind of a kind of maybe replaces some of that kind of general category stuff. So talk to us a little bit about this and what we're looking at here.
Sure. So this is less about the maintaining and offering of an API as your own system, and more about the consumption of APIs, as it's said in the title of this vulnerability. So I think this goes to show how much there's been a growing interdependence of IT systems over the past 4 years, and how much the upstream APIs, for example, if you're using Twilio or other types of developer-friendly APIs or APIs used by developers to power their own systems, if a vulnerability affects those, you don't want to be impacted by that. You have to put into place some measures to mitigate these sorts of issues. So to say it in a sentence, the zero trust model applies to third-party integrations too. Don't rely on external APIs and ensure that you're sanitizing at least the inputs that you're getting from those systems. Sorry, Jeremy, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say it's kind of like a trust but verify approach to working with third-party APIs, and I think like the zero trust model is another good way of thinking about it. It's only okay if it's been kind of if it has been kind of verified through whatever security process is right for your organization. But I think it's really important to highlight that APIs. People use various analogies talking about APIs. I've heard the plumbing of the modern internet, the connective tissue of modern applications, whatever analogy you want to use. It's obviously a thing that connects two systems, and those might be one part internal, one part external. And I don't see that trend changing anytime soon. If anything, all of the data shows that the consumption of third-party APIs is just going to go up and up and up. And so having a view as to what third-party APIs you are using and what the potential impact is there is, I know, something that a lot of organizations should be watching out for to keep a safe eye on. APIs are ultimately kind of an ecosystem type of tool. So I know that was number 10 on our list. I want to kind of get your general thoughts around the future of API security. It's been super helpful to go over this list. We've seen the evolution, we see some of these changes. What do you think is going to happen in the next couple of years regarding APIs, and maybe like how organizations think about securing them and how bad actors think about abusing them?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jeremy. I think we have to start by stating that API security as a concept, as its own concept, is relatively new. It maybe in the past 2 years that people have started talking about this as its own thing versus like application security or cloud security that have been around for a much longer time, minimum like 15 years for both of them, right? Maybe cloud security a little bit less than that, but you get the idea.
Yeah.
Um,
Yep.
So I think we have to look at historical comparables to be able to see where API security is going. At the very minimum, I think there's going to be a lot more standards covering the API security. It's no longer just going to be OWASP that has this top 10 list of vulnerabilities. There's going to be a lot more coming out, whether it's from CIS, NIST, any other framework, ISO, that are regularly published stuff for other layers of the infrastructure. They're going to start doing the same for API security. So in a word, it's going to be formalized.
Okay. And what do you think about on the attacker side? Any thoughts there?
Well, we've seen the trends. We've done the research, Jeremy. The breaches are getting bigger, more severe, affecting more
more
parts
frequent.
of the infrastructure. Yeah. So on the attacker side, I don't see this problem going away without some serious effort on the part of the whole industry to make everybody more mature about this.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that has me a little bit concerned is, I often get asked by people, hey, what's the impact of generative AI on APIs and API security in particular? And one of the things that I am keeping an eye on for sure is what can generative AI do in terms of creating and launching attacks against APIs? Can you give a generative AI tool a set of prompts that would cause it to come up with a set of requests that may look normal, but again, look to abuse the business logic of an API, maybe look for flaws in some of the things that we talked about, authentication and authorization, maybe look for, creating unsafe consumption patterns that do cause DDoSes. So, that's something that I'm certainly keeping an eye on from my perspective. As well. But I certainly appreciate your vantage point, and I think thanks for sharing that with the audience. We do have a couple of questions trickling in. I do want to take those, so let's get over to those. First question that we have here: what are the specific things that we should look at to make sure we're aligned with the OWASP API top 10? So maybe some concrete recommendations from your perspective.
Sure. Fortunately, we've recently published a sort of list of at least some issues, roughly 25 or so, that you can follow. They're highly actionable. Things like making sure that you're including the no additional properties option in your spec files, making sure that there's no possibility of a BOPLA attack using that, at least if you're enforcing it. I'm actually going to share, I think I can share in the chat, or if you could show our findings page on our websites. I think this is a very good place to start if you're looking for a list of actionable recommendations that are tied to the OWASP list. This is likely a very good place to start.
Yep, I've just dropped that link into the chat window in response to this question. So hopefully that is available to everybody. Feel free to have a browse around there. We are constantly kind of refreshing and improving that content with new discoveries that we have and with additional contextual information. It actually kind of leads well into one of the next questions that we've got here from the audience, which is how can security teams bring developers and app owners along when it comes to API security? Could not have been a nicer segue for you, Paul. So maybe talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I think it hints at the cultural problem that we often see when it comes to starting a new security initiative in any sort of business, not necessarily even in an IT business, but if I take a few examples from my past life as a cloud security practitioner, you often had to have a cross-team organization of such. One organization I was working with called it the Guardians of the Cloud, where it was cross-functional, basically a best practice working group that would meet every X amount of time to discuss what does best practice look like with regards to the cloud for our organization. If you at least start by defining what your standard is, then it becomes much easier to know what to actually enforce. If you don't know what is best practice, you know, it's not a good place to start from.
Yeah, great. I'm just typing out a little bit of a summary of what you said there. Great. Got a follow up, and I'll finish typing that in. Got another question coming in here. Do you think that protecting APIs with Open API/Swagger files and using them as a policy in the WAF is a good approach?
A policy in the WAF. So that's a new one for me. What we do recommend, and this is very much a FireTail recommendation. It's not just coming from me. I think it's, as a company, we would wholeheartedly agree that your spec file should be your source of truth with regards to how your API should behave. And there are methods out there, open source methods out there, not necessarily just from us, but we do have a method that you can use to ensure that your spec file not only is the intended source of truth for how your API should behave, but is the way that your API behaves. Essentially, there's an enforcement mechanism there. And you know, you could take a look at the FireTail libraries for this. There's others out there as well that you can do a quick Google search for. But yeah, if you want to use those, we'll be happy to help you out with them.
Awesome, awesome. And I've got a question while I post that response. I've got a question from my own side. You know, you did this analysis work around kind of the 2019 version to the 2023 version, compare and contrast exercise that we just got done, kind of going through line item by line item. I'm curious from your perspective as somebody who's been in cybersecurity for a while, has both a cybersecurity and a development background. So you've got the perspective of somebody writing code and the perspective of somebody looking at securing environments. What do you think, like kind of at a more of a feeling level? Do you feel like this new 2023 version is better, worse, or just different? If you had to kind of give an answer to that.
Yeah, it is what it is. It's a first step. It's a great first step, to be honest, because it does formalize in a way what should be done to protect APIs, but there aren't that many actual actionable insights there. The ways that you can, recommendations that you can directly take from that top 10 list and then apply in a consistent way across your entire infrastructure. This, I think, is still yet to come.
So, you know, if I hear you right, it kind of sounds like what you're saying is like, hey, great, this is a, you know, one additional step down the path of identifying the risks, but it's not necessarily, let's say, a set of controls or a set of security best practices or recommendations for how organizations should think about better designing or better protecting their APIs.
Yeah, these are guiding principles.
Right. Right. So I would almost consider them to be more of, let's say, a good starting point for a threat modeling exercise for thinking about like, hey, we're putting out a bunch of APIs into the world. What should we be worried about? You know, these are or almost like a checklist of risks and concerns that we need to think of. Got another question coming in from the audience. What's the best place to start when it comes to identifying all of the APIs in your organization?
Sure. Great question. Identifying all the APIs in your organization. Well, I think for starters, you probably need to have a chat with the people developing those APIs to see where they're actually running them. Because that's the thing with APIs, right? You can literally run them from anywhere you can have compute, right? Whether it's your own laptop that you're running a server from, or it's a cloud environment, or what have you. So have a chat with them and then see how you can get access into those environments to then ideally plug in an automated solution like FireTail, or, you know, there are others, to essentially make your inventory. And then from there, you can very easily see which ones have more traffic, which ones maybe have some vulnerabilities associated to them, which ones deserves to be spun down to limit the attack surface.
Got it. And I'm just typing up a quick summary to that for people who have posted the question. Just a quick check on time. We've literally got about 2 minutes left in our webinar today. So if you do have any last questions, now is the time to get them in. Otherwise, we will move towards kind of wrapping up in just a second here. And looks like I'm just giving a quick view onto things. Okay, looks like we've actually handled all of the questions that have come in over the chat. So with that and coming up on time, I did want to point out to everybody who's joined us today, again, just a reminder, you will be getting an email in the next couple of days with a link to the recording and a link to the report as well. If you are joining us live right now, I did also want to mention to you that I believe you should be able to go into the chat window or into the description of today's webinar and access the link directly. So the link should be in the description of today's webinar to get this report on the changes to the top 10 API security risks for 2023. With that, just one quick final check to make sure we don't have any loose threads on Q&A from the audience. I just wanted to thank you, Paul, so much for the time and effort that you've put into preparing this analysis, preparing the report for our audience, and taking the time to share your thoughts with us today. Just again, as a reminder, thank you for taking the time to join us. You'll get an email. The recording will be available. If you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out to myself or Paul or the entire FireTail team. You can just find us at www.firetail.io online. We've got this report available. We've got our previous work around the API security breach evaluation over the last 10 years. And we've got an upcoming webinar next month. We haven't yet announced the topic for that webinar, but do stay tuned for an email update that will tell you what is going to be going on. We hope to see you on that or a future webinar. And again, for myself, Jeremy, for Paul, for the entire FireTail team, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Bye-bye.